Didn't even see him coming. Totally underestimated him. I was like, yeah, I'll read your book. Yeah, sure. Went up. Poof, 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 poof. Better than food, man. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Better Than Food Book Reviews. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. Great to see you as always. Get that coffee. Today is Last Exit to Brooklyn by the American author Hubert Selby Jr., published in 1964. This is extremely overdue. I've been recommended this book for years. I can't remember who first recommended it to me, but thank you very much, whoever you are. Really appreciate it. There's a terrific documentary that I linked to below called It'll Be Better, directed by a guy named Michael W. Dean, all about Hubert Selby Jr. And it was a great source of material for this review. It's got like Lou Reed and Nick Tosches and Ellen Burstyn. It's quite good. This is a pummeling, relentless narrative of squalor set in 1950s Brooklyn in New York, in a world just under the surface, hidden from public sight. It's a descent into the pits of American urban hell. It's really like just when you thought it couldn't get worse, you're like, oh wow, it definitely can. Everything can get a lot worse. It's a side of the world you'd rather not see but can't stop reading about. Drunken sailors, prostitutes, gangs, a group of Benzedrine-hooked trans women, they call them Bennies, factory workers, working class union guys, the inhabitants of a housing project, people from the working or lower classes in the 50s. This book is like taking a shotgun to the door of the Office of Literary Convention and just blowing it off the hinges. Like, all bets are off. It's like one man taking revenge on stuffy literary convention. Here's a man who would not take it anymore. Here's a man who would not take it anymore. Here's a man who would not take it anymore. It's so innovative stylistically and kind of brash and forward and unapologetic in its visceral delivery of the truth, you know, the truth of these characters and these stories, that it's easy to see why he's considered one of the greatest authors of the 20th century, and not just American, though of course he is one of the greatest American authors of the 20th century. I mean, he captures such a time and place in this thing with such a raw authenticity that, you know, there's nothing like it. Or there are things that are sort of like it, but they have been influenced by it. It's such a place and time and atmosphere and city and environment, right? You know, you just instantly recognizable. And so, yeah, savage, right? There are very few books that hit as hard as Last Exit to Brooklyn. This was a world that was, in several ways, a lot more real, and it hurt more, it seems. But there's something about it that seemed better because it was authentic, right? Because it wasn't a facsimile of reality. It was the blunt force real deal. The book is composed of 6 different narratives that take place in a Brooklyn neighborhood. Occasionally, there are recurring characters. Few books give titles like Blood Meridian or American Psycho a run for their money in terms of descriptions of violence, right? In none of these books did I feel the violence more than in Last Exit to Brooklyn. It's like a Gaspar Noé film in 1950s New York. He could have done an excellent adaptation. It has that French extremity quality found in like La Haine or Irreversible. It's brutal, like everybody says that. I don't know if there's a single review in existence of Last Exit to Brooklyn that doesn't employ the word brutal. Because it is. It's the definition of brutality. I mean, it's so gnarly. It's so rough and gritty. Sometimes you feel like you're in a John Waters film. Other times you feel like you're in a scene from Taxi Driver or Cruising. And other times you feel like you're reading the literary equivalent of the album Filth by Swans. Go take a listen and like after 10 seconds you'll understand what I mean. I thought it was going to be pretty tough, but I mean, it sucker punched me out of nowhere. I mean, I was not prepared for the level of depravity and visceral grit that this thing just like took my face and just like slammed it on the asphalt and like rubbed gravel in my eyes. It's just like, it was, it's rough. It's a really rough book, but it's also really felt. It's very empathetic to its characters who are supremely unlikable. It really gives insight into the level of suffering that some people go through, often silently, and are confused about how to handle, how to fix, how to overcome. They don't know what's going on. It really shows all the sides of people, you know, but all of them, all the sides, like the most, like the worst, right? So it's mostly focused on the worst. You want to talk about raw, unflinching writing. This is a story of desperation, of people struggling with serious problems. economic, domestic, and mental. Whether it's being trapped in a relationship, trapped in poverty or cycles of violence, or trapped in depression, obsession, loneliness, or addiction. It's the story of many people who could use a great deal of emotional support in their lives, like all of us. And even if you're not suffering as bad as one of the characters in this book, and I certainly hope you are not, and are just going through a tough time yourself because, well, let's face it, it is not an easy time out there at all. The CDC just reported that suicide reached an all-time high in the USA last year in 2022. Not making that up. Link below. That is a fact. That kind of says it all for me. There are many methods of taking care of yourself. Some of the ones I enjoy would include exercise and eating properly. Another one is therapy. So in that case, I'd like to tell you about the sponsor of today's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp's mission is to make therapy more affordable and accessible, which is helpful because finding a therapist can be really hard, especially when you're limited by the slim options in your area, especially if you're in an area that's sort of rural. Although often I find myself just wanting to move to the woods, so kudos, but you know. But this is why BetterHelp is helpful, because you can go to the woods or wherever you like on the top of a mountain, a small, remote, beautiful town in Italy or Utah or wherever, and you can still have access to your therapist. So there you go. They make finding a therapist easier because it's online, it's remote, and by filling out a few questions, BetterHelp can match you with a therapist in as little as a few days. It's easy to sign up and get matched with a therapist. There's a link in my description. It's betterhelp.com/BTF. Clicking that link helps support this channel, but it also gets you 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, so you can connect with a therapist and see if that helps you. And because finding a therapist is a little bit like dating, if you don't really fit with that therapist, which is a common thing in therapy, you can easily switch to a new therapist at no additional cost without stressing about insurance, who's in your network, or anything like that. So if you're struggling right now, and who isn't, let's face it, consider online therapy with BetterHelp. Click the link in the description or visit betterhelp.com/BTF. Thank you again, BetterHelp, for supporting this channel. The only things that come close to it in terms of raw, unflinching writing that I can think of would be Nick Tosches, Michael Girard, the lead singer of Swans, maybe J.G. Ballard, and Hal Bennett's Lord of Dark Places, which seems almost certainly inspired by this book, as do the others, save for Ballard. I don't know if he was inspired by Selby, but I wouldn't be surprised at all. All these authors seem almost certainly influenced by Selby, and this book in particular. So yeah, you have all these graphic depictions of violence, but the deeply disturbing thing, what's more disturbing than the violence and only heightened by it, is the emotional suffering of the characters, which, even given or perhaps because of the extreme, provocative, experimental writing style, comes through in powerful waves of visceral, convincing sadness, like sedimentary layers on top of you. By the end of this thing, you're just like, you're drowning in these stories, right? You're drowning in the emotions of these characters. It's just too much to handle, man. It's all too intense. All these American broken lives and broken dreams. Really about the things that nobody's gonna want to show you about this country. It is a truly sad book, and somehow fundamentally American. Totally just like, you know, captures the spirit of an age. Yet is totally ahead of its time in many ways. Although I think it actually was not appreciated here nearly as much as it was overseas in Europe. I think the French really took to Hubert Selby Jr., if I'm not mistaken. I think the Europeans really took him seriously, whereas here I think he was kind of discarded, like something that didn't want to be seen. It's magnifying a very desperate, violent slice of life, but you know, it does exist, right? It's just devastating what the people are going through in this book, right? Even the people you hate, right? Even the people you're disgusted by, which is nearly everybody. It's hard to read about. It's fun to read it because it is an experimental style and it moves fast. It's like Kerouac or something. But it's, you know, so it's addictive to read, but it's also hard to read because of the content. But it's undeniably powerful, right? It really is. But it's like, yeah, it's like stepping in the ring with Hubert Selby Jr. and, you know, and I'm telling you, man, he just got in there to me and he just beat the shit out of me. Didn't even see him coming, totally underestimated him. I was like, yeah, I'll read your book. Yeah, sure. When poof, 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 poof. Uppercut, jab, jab. Nobody's gonna get that. Few books inspire more empathy with people you'd otherwise despise. You don't like them, you don't forgive them, but you understand their actions more. It's the hallmark of a great author. Makes me think of Flaubert, actually, with like Madame Bovary, where she like grabs a fistful of arsenic, right? You don't like Madame Bovary, but you get, well, I don't. I find her annoying, but you know, you understand why she's doing what she's doing, and it's brutal. There is comedy in Last Exit, but it's the kind wherein, you know, sort of throw your hands up in defeat and go, what are you going to do, right? It's like the kind where you're either going to laugh or kill yourself. In that documentary below, the literary critic Michael Silverblatt said, "The subject of Last Exit to Brooklyn is about the disappearance of love, and its substitute in all kinds of forms. It's America, so business, unions, prostitution, all kinds of moneyed activities substituting for love." I would add to that, I think it's about, I personally think the book is about characters who mistake things for love. Everybody. Just about everybody. I don't think there's a single character you read about who's actually experienced love. Georgette with her going after Vinny, Harry Black with his trans women that he hangs out with, Harry Black's wife for that matter. Yeah, there's a lot of people who mistake things for love. But there's no character in here that I could definitively point to and say they've experienced true love. No. Tra-la-la does not appear to be looking for love at all. What was Tra-la-la looking for, the prostitute in the story Tra-la-la? I think empowerment through financial means, through prostitution. But then that just, when that became clear that that was never going to emancipate her, then what it turned into was just sort of like this self-destruction, right? I don't think Tra-la-la was ever looking for love. Some of the other characters maybe, but not her. I can't remember any indication that she was, you know? It's a fantastic book. Depraved, but with a moral foundation. Not in like a finger-wagging way, but in just like a common sense kind of way. Sensational yet lucid, raw, cutting, moving, depressing, exciting, and absolutely savage. It both is and is not reality. It's, again, it's a very specific milieu, right? It's extreme and it's dark and it's kind of a consolidation of a whole bunch of horrible things, but it is real, you know? Nobody could read this book and be like, that never happened. You know, because we all know that all of this shit has happened and worse, right? It doesn't get a lot worse. I guess it does get worse than this, but it's like, but not much, you know? It's extreme and it's dark and it's real. There's no story in here that hasn't taken place in reality in some kind of permutation, right? None of it will be so grotesque that you won't immediately recognize the real world. But it's just like an onslaught. The entire book feels like one long run-on sentence, right? This is a bit from the first story, Another Day, Another Dollar. It's all these guys, like this gang hanging out, basically. These guys who hang out at this diner called The Greeks, somewhere in Brooklyn. And they just loiter, basically, and talk shit and fight, you know, for fun when they're bored. So this gives you a feel for like that run-on sentence thing, the kind of escalating tension of his writing. Yeah. And it's kind of written in the vernacular too, right? So it's like street, right? Like, yeah, Brooklyn, 50s, right? And they watched the cars pass, giving hard looks and spitting. And who laid this broad and who laid that one? And someone took a small brush from his pocket and cleaned his suede shoes, then rubbed his hands and adjusted his clothing. And someone else flipped a coin, and when it dropped, a foot stamped on it before it could be picked up. And as he moved the leg from the coin, his hair was mussed, and he called him a fuck, and whipped out his comb. And when his hair was once more neatly in place, it was mussed again, and he got salty as hell. And the other guys laughed, and someone else's hair was mussed, and they shoved each other, and someone else shoved, and then someone suggested a game of mum and said Vinny should start, and they yelled, yeah. And Vinny said, what the fuck, he'd start. And they formed a circle around him, and he turned slowly, jerking his head quickly, trying to catch the one punching him so he would replace him in the center. And he was hit in the side, and when he turned, he got hit again. And as he spun around, two fists hit him in the back, then another in the kidney. And he buckled, and they laughed, and he jerked around and caught a shot in the stomach and fell. But he pointed and he left the center and just stood for a minute in the circle, catching his wind, then started punching and felt better when he hit Tony a good shot in the kidney without being seen. And Tony slowed down and got pelted for a few minutes, then finally pointed, and Harry said he was full of shit. He didn't really see him hit him. But he was thrown in the center anyway, and Tony waited and hooked him hard in the ribs, and the game continued for another 5 minutes or so, and Harry was still in the center, panting and almost on his knees, and they were rapping him pretty much as they pleased. But they got bored, and the game broke up, and they went back in the Greeks. Harry still bent and panting, the others laughing, and went to the lavatory to wash. Yeah, it's kind of like that. But that's a very light scene from this book. The tension is always present, though. It's always ramping up. The book is always ramping up to some obscene, disgusting, horrific climax. The book is like a boxing match, right? You're stepping in the ring with a guy who likes to fight, and it just ramps up and ramps up and ramps up, and then you just get your teeth knocked out, right? But you kind of love it because it's very impressive. It's very, very impressive. He really didn't obey any rules because I believe, as he says actually in the introduction, like he wasn't aware of any, right? When he started writing, he didn't go to school for this. He just read, got inspired, and did his own thing. You know, this is so, it's great. At times it makes you marvel at what a person can take and still persevere. At others it is deeply, deeply fucked up in its portrayal of what some people do when they go past the breaking point, whether out of desperation, indifference, or unfortunately just out of pure sadistic boredom, to fuck shit up, both themselves and others. Without the emotional component of empathetic sensitivity that Selby brings to the table, the violence in the book wouldn't have half the power it does. His sensitivity is really what allows him to destroy you as a reader, and we love him for it. The first story, Another Day, Another Dollar, contains one of the most graphic, brutal depictions of violence I have ever read. It's those guys I was reading to you about. They go and they beat up this sailor. They like gang stomp him. Certainly on the same level as something like American Psycho or Blood Meridian. The Queen is Dead concerns a trans woman named Georgette, who hangs out at this Brooklyn diner, the Greeks, where these recurring characters Vinny and Harry always seem to be hanging about. Georgette is in love with Vinny, what she thinks of as love, and she invites him and his friends over to a party with a bunch of her gin-drinking trans friends sky high on Benzedrine, looking for love in the wrong places. The absolute worst places you could look, really. These guys are like the definition of trouble. Not Georgette and her friends, the guys. They're just prison material, right? Just like bad guys. The tension in the book in each story is just nauseating through and through. You barely want to turn the page, but you can't stop reading because his style is just so readable. So fast, so addictive, it's so natural in a way, even though it's experimental. It's like Kerouac's On the Road, but way darker. And Baby Makes 3 is actually the only story in the book where nothing terrible happens. It's just someone from the neighborhood recounting the story of this couple that had a kid and got married. And that's it. It was really surprising, kind of. And everybody seems to have a great time at the wedding, and so it's like this black sheep in the collection of stories, because everything else is so awful. So, Tra-La-La is about the life of a prostitute of the same name, from the beginning of her journey to the horrific end. Strike is the longest in the book, and the story of the unlikable union worker Harry Black, as he is in the process of a mental breakdown as he discovers his repressed homosexuality while the factory that he works at is shut down for a strike. It's the longest and most in-depth of the book, and probably, I mean, there's a good argument that it's the best story. It's the most developed, I think. It's got a bit of a Frankie Teardrop vibe to it, right? Frankie Teardrop is off the self-titled album by Suicide. That's got to be the most frightening song I've ever heard. You know, interesting bit of trivia. There is a terrific clip of Henry Rollins talking about that song, and he turned out to be a real Hubert Selby Jr. champion, and a good friend of his as well. There's some great clips on YouTube talking about him. Anyways, I've linked to him talking about this song below, and I highly recommend for anybody who is adventurous enough to listen to that whole album, Suicide by Suicide. It's kind of monumental in music history, punk rock music history, but just music history in general. It was just so ahead of its time, right? Strike was great. I don't know if it's my favorite. I liked the first two a lot. I like the atmosphere of like the gritty 1950s atmosphere, right? It's just like, it's so raw, man. Like, it's just like all that Nick Tasha's shit. Like, I love that whole thing. And yeah, finally the book ends with Land's End, this collection of domestic snippets and anecdotes and stories from the lives of various inhabitants of a hellish housing project. Like, seriously. Personally, I felt the strongest pieces in the book were the first few, Another Day, Another Dollar, The Queen is Dead, and Strike. Strike is the longest, it's the most in-depth, it's the most intense, in my opinion. This was a tremendously influential novel, right? The Queen is Dead, for example, is the title of a very famous album and very famous song by The Smiths, yes. Amazing song, amazing album. As they say in the documentary below, there's a real musical quality to Hubert Selby Jr.'s writing. A rhythm, like brutal but driving, like Charlie Parker, who's mentioned in the book a few times, I think. The Bird. He seems to be kind of like the soundtrack to the book, Charlie Parker. He has these little idiosyncratic things he does in his writing, right? Like he'll indent the first word of the next paragraph far to the right to make you pause for a moment, or at least I think that's the intention. And instead of using an apostrophe in a word like I'll, like I apostrophe LL, he'll use a slash. So it'll be like I slash, big slash, LL. I thought it was a typo at first. I'm sure a lot of people did. But yeah, It's got this weird, violent, experimental feeling to it. And then in the final story, Land's End, filled with all the various residents of this absolutely awful housing project, he just turns it up to 11 and starts writing in all capitals for these arguments between this couple, Vinny and Mary. I assume the same Vinny from the previous stories. Hubert Selby Jr. ran away from home and joined the Merchant Marines, like his father, during World War II. And you can't make this shit up. He was on a ship transporting cattle carcasses, like for food. Well, the cattle were infected with tuberculosis, and he contracted it. So then he comes back to America and they put him in a sanatorium and tell him he's only got a couple months to live. And his mother gets streptomycin, this experimental drug off the black market, and they give it to him. And basically, in his own words, he goes crazy. So then his whole tuberculosis ward in the sanatorium dies, except him. That's the story of the author who writes stuff like this. What else could it be? So Hubert Selby Jr., or Cubby as he was known to friends, definitely had a serious experience with pain and suffering and tragedy from a young age, right? He also wrote the book Requiem for a Dream, which, of course, many of us, myself included, grew up watching and were scarred from for life. It's one of the saddest films ever made. Selby himself at one time had a heroin addiction. They gave him morphine for his pain in the hospital because they had to remove ribs out of his back to try and treat this tuberculosis. And yeah, they gave him morphine, and this is what happens. This is an anecdote from the documentary below. After Last Exit got published in 1964, he got a ton of money for the book. But yeah, he was hooked on heroin, so he just blew it. He moved out to LA to get away from the drugs in New York, and wound up broke and working in the gift shop of the Mondrian Hotel on Sunset. And a friend of his came to see him and said, "I know you got money for Last Exit, so where is it?" And Cubby replies, "You want to see $60,000? He just holds up his arms with track marks. For the record, 60 grand in 1964, the year this book was published, the year he got that money, was over $500,000 in today's buying power. Man, that's dark. But it had a happy ending. He started teaching at USC, started teaching writing at USC, and he lived to be 75, and he seemed to have a lot of friends, and people loved him, and yeah, he seemed to have a pretty good life, all in all. Despite the unbelievably rocky beginning. I can't wait to read more by him, but I'm gonna wait for a while. That's plenty for now. The poet Allen Ginsberg said that this book would explode like a rusty, hellish bombshell over America and still be eagerly read in 100 years. And I'll take that bet. Better than food. Check it out. So you should read it. Geez, well, if you like Burroughs, Ballard, and Kerouac, and you can deal with reading about the scraping, bleeding pain of the dregs of society, then yeah, get it. Coffee time. For those of you who are new, welcome. Thank you very much for stopping by and watching. I take all the names of the patrons on Patreon who have donated $5 or more to the show, and I place their names in this mason jar, and for every review, I pull out a name, and whoever's name I pull out is sent a hard copy of the book I'm reviewing, plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And the coffee is delicious. If you would like to get in on that and help support the show, thank you very much. You can click on the link below or go to patreon.com/booksarbettherthanfood and donate $5 or more per video, and I sincerely appreciate it. Thank you. If you donate just $1 or more on Patreon, you will get access to all these reviews ad-free, plus the patron-only reviews, the Discord channel, and the Better Than Friday newsletter that I send out every Friday, which is just a list of 5 different things that I'm interested in at any given time. Could be books in the pipeline, music, films, articles. It changes every week. And I put little photos on there of stuff I see out in the world. So that's fun. And international shipping is included. All right. Thank you very much to all my patrons, and best of luck. Okay, here we go. Liliana M. Thank you very much, Liliana. Really appreciate it. You're going to receive Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr., plus a bag of coffee, roasted by yours truly. And I hope you love both as much as I. Cheers. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this, and always remember, die reading. All right. Take care of yourselves. Have a great night. Talk to you soon. Ciao.